Every year I see the same mistakes in dissertations. Mistakes that cost students marks, even when their ideas are strong. You might be making one of these dissertation mistakes right now and not even know it. The good news is that they are easily fixable. In this video, I'm going to walk you through 3 common mistakes I see in dissertations every year. These mistakes often reflect structural issues that weaken your argument, confuse the reader, and cost you marks, often without you realizing it. And guess what? Every top dissertation I've marked avoided these mistakes. Not because they were perfect, but because by avoiding these mistakes, they were well structured, specific, and ultimately clear. We will look at examples from student dissertations, some that missed the mark and others that nailed it, so that you can see exactly what works and what doesn't. My ultimate goal is to show you how to avoid these mistakes and strengthen your work. And if you're working on your dissertation right now, stay with me, because these 3 fixes could make the difference between an average and the top grade. I often come across mistake number 1, which is there being no consistency in the statement describing what their research is about. There are 2 moments where the key focus of the research is defined: the title of the dissertation and the aim of the research. And this means that both need to be the same. Yet, there is often inconsistency, with this inconsistency visible in the different wording being used for the title and for the aim. As I often say, the aim is the title and the title is the aim. So repeat after me: the aim is the title is the aim. The aim is the title is the aim. It is really important that you remember this, as if they are different, it will likely create all sorts of problems throughout the dissertation. I am now going to show you examples of when students got it right and when they didn't. And as a caveat, several of the title and aims I'm going to show you have weaknesses which I am not going to comment on. In this video, the purpose is simply to look at the consistency between the title and the aim. Let's start with 3 examples that show inconsistencies. This example is an example of poor practice because the 2, the title and the aim, are very different. The title mentions cultural change and traditions, and the aim mentions wedding rituals and guest dynamics. I guess what the student tried to do here was to specify in the aim what about cultural change and traditions she was focusing on. In this instance, rituals and guest dynamics. But if what is in the aim are the specific areas of focus, then this should be in the title. There are also other minor differences between the aim and the title, which are not good practice. The 2 should be exactly the same. The first thing we notice in this next example is the massive difference in length between the title and the aim. The title is quite short and straight to the point, and the aim is overly long and convoluted. The aim also seems to cover 2 parts when it should cover only 1. The one main area the dissertation focuses on. Some of it overcomplicates. For example, when the student says to gain a rich and nuanced understanding, it should simply be to understand. She also seems to be including objectives in the aim when she says explore how Zimbabwean consumers perceive, interpret, and evaluate these offerings, and identify the underlying factors that shape their attitudes and potential demand. This final example of poor practice explicitly identifies 2 aims when there should be only 1. To examine what motivates activists in the United States to identify with the anti-death penalty abolition movement, and to analyze how activists use events to articulate their identities and promote their worldview. As a consequence of including 2 aims, it is also way too long. Now let's look at 2 examples of dissertations that did not make this mistake. As you can see in example 1, both the title and the aim are the same. The only difference is the beginning of the sentence, since the title is a standalone statement and the aim is presented as part of a narrative. Hence the change from a comparison to compare. The aim of this research is to compare the influences and then explain what the comparison is. And in this second example, the student didn't even use a verb at the beginning of the title statement. it simply starts with the effectiveness, rather than something like an analysis of the effectiveness or an examination of the effectiveness. Because the aim is in narrative form, the student then has to add the verb, in this instance, to examine. In these cases, the aim is the title and the title is the aim, which is what it should be. And if you restate the aim in other parts of the dissertation, for example in the methodology or in the conclusion, you should continue to repeat the same text. Your aim, as defined in the introduction, should remain unchanged throughout the document. The second mistake is one of the easiest to fix. Many students place information about the characteristics of the sample at the beginning of the results chapter, but this is not the right place for this information. Let's look at some poor examples followed by good ones. This first example comes from a qualitative dissertation, and it's not a good example because the student started the data analysis and discussion chapter with a section on participant overview. This second example comes from a quantitative dissertation and starts the results and discussion chapter with a section on demographic profile of participants. In addition, the student used pie charts instead of tables. Not only this is not a very academic way of presenting data, the end result is that what should be covered probably in a page was covered over 3.5 pages for no benefit. Before showing you examples of good practice, it is important to address the question, why are you presenting the characteristics of the sample in the dissertation? And we do so for three main reasons. The first one is transparency. Presenting the characteristics of participants allows other researchers to understand exactly who was studied. The second one is about generalizability and transferability. Knowing the sample helps readers judge how findings might apply to other populations. A diverse and representative sample can support broader generalization, and a narrow sample might suggest findings are specific to that group. And the third reason is that it helps contextualizing the findings. It helps readers interpret your results appropriately. In other words, in light of who answered the questions, who participated in the study. Now, let's contrast this against the purpose of the results chapter. The results chapter focuses on the findings of the research. And by findings, we mean anything that helps address the objectives of the research. Because the characteristics of the sample have nothing to do with answering the research questions, they do not belong in this chapter. If not in the results chapter, where does it fit? And the answer is in the methodology chapter. The methodology chapter is where you describe how the study was conducted, and this includes sampling issues, how participants were selected, the sampling method, who the participants are, sample characteristics, and why that sample was appropriate for your research questions. Therefore, sample characteristics should be part of the methodology. Let's look at the examples of good practice. The first example comes from a qualitative dissertation, and in chapter 3 of this dissertation, the student addressed methodology issues. In section 3.6, it specifically addresses sampling, and within this section there is a subsection, 3.6.3, which addresses participant profile and diversity. And this is where the characteristics of the sample are summarized. This description, this analysis of the characteristics of the sample is supported by a table, which in most cases is really helpful. In this example of a dissertation which employed quantitative research, chapter 3 is also about the methodology, with section 3.5 addressing sampling. Within it, a table with the sample characteristics is provided. Simply put, anything that is part of the process should be in the methodology chapter. The results chapter is reserved for outcomes, what you discovered. In practice, this means that in the results chapter, you present the results of the statistical tests if you are doing quantitative research, and for qualitative research, you present the themes you identified that answer the research objectives. If you're finding this information helpful and want to go deeper, I've created a virtual tutor resource packed with videos that walk you through every area of the dissertation, from refining your topic to writing a strong conclusion. And if you'd prefer tailored support, I also offer one-to-one sessions where we work through your dissertation together. You will find both links below. Revisiting the objectives in the conclusion is a must, but many students do not address them explicitly. And this is mistake number 3. You should explicitly address objectives in the conclusion, because by revisiting objectives, you show that your research has actually delivered on what it promised in the introduction. Bear in mind that in the introduction you ask questions, the objectives, and in the conclusion you are expected to answer them, what you found in relation to each objective. In addition, by framing the findings in relation to the objectives, you are more likely to highlight what the research adds to existing knowledge or practice. Answering objectives in the conclusion also prepares the ground for recommendations and future research, helping to naturally flow into the next section, which addresses what should change or be further explored. Let's look at 2 examples, one not so good and a good one. In this example, the student defined 4 objectives in the introduction, and while she identifies some outcomes in the conclusion, she does not relate them to these specific objectives. In the end, the reader does not know what outcomes belong to what objectives, or in other words, what parts of the answer relate to what objectives. This ambiguity will lose you marks. In addition, there is a lot of text that is not about outcomes, but about process. For example, how data was collected and analyzed. If we look at each paragraph, we have paragraph 1 and 2, which seem to be rational. Paragraph 3 seems to be about methodology, and 4 is about outcomes. But there are 2 lines. Had the student revisited the objectives, there would naturally be much more about outcomes in the conclusion. In the end, there is very little about outcomes, and therefore this conclusion would score low. Example 2 is actually an excellent example, not only because the objectives are revisited, but also because each objective is addressed very well. In particular, this specific objective covers 5 areas that you can and should consider when addressing objectives. There is a thematic imbalance. In this instance, the objective is about barriers and limitations, and it provides a balanced summary of both. It shows interpretive depth and theory integration, when it brings in theory to make sense of the results. And this shows critical reasoning because it reflects about the contribution to the literature, not just alignment with it. When she demonstrates interdependence among themes, the student recognizes interrelationships between variables, and this indicates complex thinking and a more holistic perspective of the findings, what I call the big picture. And finally, it highlights contextual divergence, showing nuanced insights provided by the context of the research. I will not explain how the paper does this in detail here, as this video is already long, and I use this case study to explain how to write a top conclusion in a video that features in the virtual tutor resource. One important condition to be able to write a strong conclusion is to write strong objectives. Yet, many students struggle to write their conclusion because they focus on process rather than end objectives. If you want to know more about these 2 types of objectives, I recommend you watch this video, and YouTube thinks you will like this one. Thank you for watching.